And welcome to the Road from Emmaus. This is Prawn and Kit. We decided to take a interesting detour or a pause at this point, and rather than call it a formal rest stop, we're calling it sticking points. After some deliberation and reflection on the last couple of episodes, weeks 72 and 73, Kit and I thought it might be important to almost maybe take the perspective of someone on the street who had just heard everything that we've shared the last couple of weeks. And we just want to name too that we know some of these concepts, ideas, terms may be startling, confusing, foreign, and all of those are the right things to feel and think at this point too. And so knowing that and wanting to be responsive to where our audience is, we really just wanted to land here for a little bit too, and then name some sticking points, right? Name some tensions, some big ideas, some wonderings that probably you guys maybe aren't able to verbalize to us directly. And so me kind of taking the perception and the position of someone on the street, engaging with Kit in a very informal dialogue about some of these, and hopefully at the end of our time and the next hour or so, you have a much better understanding, and hopefully we've addressed some of the tensions that maybe you were feeling after our last couple of episodes. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. Once again, our reference texts are still going to be Luke 1 and 2, and then Matthew 1. We're just going to kind of do stream of consciousness. I will end up breaking this into two separate parts because I know it's going to be a lengthy discourse. So we will not have a formal stop and start like we do on a typical episode. With that, let's jump in, Kit. While Israel's scriptures, the Old Testament, don't explicitly name the Incarnation, it is clear that a proper and full understanding of its eternal and cosmic implications is critical to the process of Christoformity. This is Ephesians 4:13 through 15. Linked to the inbreaking of the kingdom and the world became flesh, week 72 and 73, as I just referenced, this study elevates anticipated theological sticking points that are important to name and resolve now in an effort to later build on an accurate and fully formed perspective of the Incarnation, rooted in Israel's redemptive story and history rather than abstract philosophies, which, as you guys remember, in week 72, we really tried to unpack and talk about just the dangers of stopping there. And so with that, Kid, let's jump into our first sticking point, which is this, that the Incarnation is framed outside traditional God-man categories. And some of those tensions may arise. And if you're looking at the notes, which I strongly encourage you guys to reference here, which are linked in the description box, all these quotes come from the notes that we've attached in either the week 72 or week 73 study. But some of those quotes, Kid, are Israel's scriptures don't speak of carnation as such, or the scriptures treat the Incarnation as the God of Israel taking up Israel's life and circumstance in himself. We know those on their surface may be startling, maybe a little confusing, a little scandalous. And so some of the reasons why this may be challenging is that many believers are introduced to the Incarnation primarily through later doctrinal formulations, e.g., fully God and fully man, two natures in one person. This study intentionally reframes incarnation through Israel's story rather than abstract metaphysics. Without a redemptive historical lens, this can certainly feel like a departure from the orthodoxy rather than deepening it. And so one of the things, Kit, that I think we've named, and I'll kind of jump in with some questions here, is we think an underlying root to some of this tension may be not yet seeing how doctrinal formulations emerge from the biblical narrative rather than replacing that. And so, Kit, one of the things I could see someone on the street maybe bumping into you and asking is, so just so I'm clear, are you saying that the Old Testament didn't really teach incarnation? I think people might be skeptical how it just quote unquote emerges in the New Testament. What would you say to that tension?
Well, we touched on that a little bit in our previous episodes, but in some ways we have to kind of define what we're getting at, because from one perspective, if to say, okay, the Old Testament, Israel scriptures, doesn't have anything at all to say about incarnation. Right. Well, I wouldn't say that, but do Israel's scriptures teach the doctrine of incarnation as we understand it? One day God is going to take up human flesh and we're going to have this person who is a God man. The Old Testament doesn't speak in that sort of way. As we talked about it, the case that the scriptures build is God's intent to in a sense, be intimately connected with his world through an intimate connection with the creature that he creates in his image and likeness to be son of God. And that concept of son of God, son of is, the son is of the Father. When you see the Son, you see the Father. And so even in Luke's genealogy, Luke traces Jesus' human ancestry back to Adam, who he refers to as son of God. It's all this so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, all the way back to Adam, son of God. So this concept of sonship with respect to human beings is very much son of God with respect to human beings is very much an Old Testament concept. Israel was son of God. David was son of God. David was going to have a preeminent son that God said, he will be my son and I will be his father, and I'll establish your house and your throne and your kingdom. So language of intimacy between God and human beings is very much a part of the Old Testament story. And as we talked, I think in episode 72, a good place for our listeners and viewers to go is to Isaiah's 4 servant songs in 42, 49, 50, and then the end of 52 and through 53. And most Christians, as we mentioned, are familiar with Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. That's the last of the 4 servant songs. But in those servant songs, the way they work in Isaiah's prophecy is God is talking about the way in which he's going to be faithful to Abraham and fulfill his promise that through Abraham and through Abraham's offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. God is going to solve the creational alienation, death, curse through Abraham and Abraham's offspring. Well, Israel was to be that, and Israel failed. God's going to now raise up from within Israel one who will be, obviously, a part of Israel, but will be what Israel could not be and would not be, son, servant, disciple, and witness to the nations in truth. And it was in and through that one somehow that this was the way in which and the one through which Yahweh himself was going to fulfill his promise to return to Zion. He had gone into exile. He had gone away when he sent the people away. So what Israel was waiting for and what they were looking for in this coming messianic work and, what we see as the Christ event, the way the New Testament will present that, what Israel was waiting for leading up to the birth of Jesus was for Yahweh, their God, to return to them and once again dwell among them, take his place among them, and liberate them and heal them and forgive them and restore them so that they could at last be the light of the nations, the Abrahamic people through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed and gathered back to God. So that's what they were waiting for, and they connected that based on what their scripture said. They connected that return of Yahweh to them. He was going to return to them and dwell with them. They connected that way in which he was going to return was through this particular anointed servant. Messiah means anointed one, and there was going to be a particular servant out of Israel associated with this son promised to David, who was going to be the way in which somehow Yahweh would return. And I imagine that the Jews expected that when this son of David, man, son of Abraham, Israelite, came and did this great messianic delivering, restoring work, then Yahweh would return to be among them again by his Shekinah, his glory presence, again returning to the temple. We talked about how when they built the second temple, the Lord's glory never returned. So that's the way that the Israel scriptures taught them to think about how Yahweh would return and be with us, but also in connection with a son of David, a man, a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David, an Israelite from within Israel, but somehow through that one and through his anointing with the Spirit, Yahweh would once again return and be with us. So the Old Testament doesn't talk in terms of one day a person is going to be born who's going to be fully God and fully man, of the same substance of divinity as God and the same substance of humanity as human beings, yet without sin, two natures, one person, indivisible, not confused. Those philosophical ways of talking about incarnation, no, the Old Testament does not talk in that way. And we're going to see as we get into the gospel accounts and the way they tell the story of the conception and the birth and the life and the death and resurrection of Jesus, the way they tell the Christ event is they present this, what we would call doctrine of incarnation, in exactly the way that we've just been describing. He is the one in whom we see the fulfillment of these things. Yahweh's promise to return to Zion, a son of Abraham, a son of David, an Israelite indeed, a servant, son, disciple, and witness, through whom Israel will be reconstituted and healed and restored. That's the way the gospel writers want to present him, and even importantly in connection with John the Baptist, which we'll get to that as well. John was the forerunner who would herald Yahweh's return to Zion. And who does John point to? Jesus. This is the way in which Yahweh is returning to Zion.
Yeah, like, I think we'll definitely get some people back over the fence on that one. And they're like, okay, so it's not explicit, but it is implicit, right? And there's a lot of nuance there. But then I also think people could say, kid, too, well, wait a minute, too. Like, I feel like we just moved the goalposts, right? Isn't this now redefining what Christians hold as the incarnation? And a follow-up, Kit, speaking to this would be is, how does this then connect to what I've learned about Jesus being fully God and fully man, right? Because I think even though we feel like we've maybe closed one door or answered one question, I think what it does is it now opens up a Pandora's box of other things. And I think what people are really fearful of, Kit, too, just to kind of be vulnerable here, is I've been taught certain things in Sunday school. I've grown up in the church for 30 or 40 years, too, is I've been led to believe that this is a clean package. And now we're kind of blowing that up from the inside out, too. And so help us kind of put these parts back together in like a redemptive historical fashion, Kit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think that certainly in conservative 20th century, 21st century evangelicalism, the way, as you said, whether we're Lutherans or Baptists or Presbyterians or whatever, even Roman Catholics, we've been taught that one of the absolute essential touchstones of Orthodox Christianity is that Jesus is fully God and fully man, with a doctrine of the Trinity and a doctrine of Jesus as fully God and fully man. And if you don't believe that if you believe he's just a good teacher, or you believe he's just a man or whatever, or you believe he's a lesser God of some sort, the Arian heresy, then you aren't truly a Christian. You have to believe he's fully God and fully man. But the problem is that people just stop with that and they say, okay, yes, I can agree to that. I can, put my hand on the Chalcedonian Creed or these ancient statements of orthodoxy that we've inherited from the past. And that's all I need to do. Okay, yes, I agree. Jesus is fully God and fully man. But we don't stop to say, okay, what do we mean by that? And so what we're presenting here is not saying, no, that's false. Jesus is not the God-man. But we're saying, how is that the case? What does that look like? How do we understand that? Because God is just a word, right? I mean, everybody believes in God, or most people believe in God or a God, or my God is like this, my God is that, I think God is this. God is just this nebulous, undefined concept. And even the idea of man, okay, what are we really talking about here? And if we're just saying nothing more than somehow this substance that we call godness is stuck together with this substance that we call humanness, and we get now what, a hybrid, or we get what? How does this work? Well, we're not really solving any kinds of issues, and I would argue we're not answering any of these questions. So we're not denying that Jesus is fully God and fully man. We're saying that we have to understand what that means in scriptural language, in scriptural's understanding, because as we're going to see, even as we move down the road, the issue of Jesus being fully God and fully man is critically important to understanding God's intent for the world that has human beings at the center. This isn't just some abstract doctrine that floats out in space. Oh, gee, I can't really be a true Christian if I don't hold to the hypostatic union that Jesus is fully God and fully man. Okay, I believe that. I guess I'm really a Christian. Well, this isn't about believing abstract doctrines. This is about understanding who this person, Jesus the Messiah, is, what God has actually accomplished in him, what that means for us individually, but more broadly, what that means for God's renewal and restoration and consummation of his purposes for a human race and for the world. If we don't get in, here's kind of the bottom line, I guess. If we don't get incarnation right, then we can't understand anything else. And as much as we want to say, oh, I have to believe that doctrine to be a Christian, if we don't understand the meaning of that doctrine, what that's really all about, then we really don't even have a gospel to proclaim. We don't even know what it means to be a Christian. We don't know what it is that this is all about. We have no idea. We just have this abstract idea of God and man being stuck together in some kind of weird one-off kind of union. And that's not satisfactory to our Christian lives and understanding in the message that we proclaim.
And Kid, I would argue too that we can't even get incarnation right if we don't first get creation right, because
Yep,
it actually fits on
absolutely.
top of that. And I would go a step farther in saying that if we don't get creation and incarnation right, we definitely don't get consummation right. And scripture reveals that, because once again, we know there are many conflicting concepts and beliefs about what it means for this world to be consummated too. And so I love this conversation, Kid, and I want to continue to build on it with another sticking point that I think will probably be seen as scandalous, but we're gonna go into deep water nonetheless, Kid. Too, Kid. One of the phrases too that you and I use quite a bit too is this phrase that Jesus is described as embodying Israel and fulfilling the covenant from both sides, right? And so, once again, when we start to use these terms, and we'll spend the next 10, 15 minutes unpacking it, it's important that we explain to people what we mean by embody, right? Because everyone comes with their own perceptions and understanding. Where some of these tensions may arise are phrases from our last couple studies, such as this. This individual would embody Israel as the true son of Abraham. Once again, that may be a foreign concept to you. Just even those words being put in a sentence together may not be registering right. This Israel would embody both sides of the covenant and its obligations, right? We know covenants are rooted in obligations for both parties. Think of a contract too, but helping us understand that from a redemptive historical standpoint can be a little confusing. Why this may be challenging is the idea of Jesus as corporate Israel in person is not commonly taught at an entry level or in many churches, period. Without familiarity and covenant theology, election, and representative headship, this language can sound abstract or even confusing symbolically. So, some of the things we've talked about, Kid, and I think we're going to unpack in the next few moments are this may lack categories for representation, covenant headship, corporate identity, which are essential to understanding substitution, obedience, justification. All of these things, obviously, people come with a lot of their own preconceived notions, Kid, thing they've learned in Sunday school, the churches they grew up in, too. So, some of the common questions, too, which I anticipate, and just kind of getting into the position of someone on the street, Kid, someone can be like, wait a minute, how can one person, how can a singular person represent a corporate entity? Thinking about it from an ethnic, from a heritage standpoint, from a historical standpoint, how is that even possible mathematically, Kid, too? I think people have a lot of tensions on that first question.
Well, and I guess the place to begin is to say that this is how the scriptures speak of this coming servant. We mentioned the servant songs before, and God identifying an entity. Now, people could argue, well, it's not entirely clear that's just one person, but God does identify an entity out of Israel that he says, you are Israel. and you are the one in whom I will save Israel. But it's not enough that you should be that restorer of Israel. I'm making you a light of the nations, that my salvation would go to all the ends of the earth. I make you, therefore, a covenant of a people. I cause you to be a covenant for the sake of a people. And that's kind of the second part of this that we'll talk about. But that's, again, Isaiah 49, the second servant song. And so the scriptures do speak in this sort of a way. Okay, well, what do we do with that? How do we understand it? As you said, how can one person be the nation or whatever? And once again, we have to think about this concept of Israel as a covenantal concept. We emphasize this over and over and over again. In our time and in our vernacular, Israel is either the land over there in the Middle East or it's the Jewish people collectively. And in the scriptures, Israel is specifically first and foremost, it is the one descendant of Abraham named Jacob. The covenant passes from Abraham to Isaac, then Isaac to Jacob. Jacob is renamed Israel. And that name, Israel, has its own meaning. It really refers to this one who prevails with God, Yisrael, one who prevails with God. But in the context of Jacob being named Israel, he prevails in this kind of wrestling match with a man who is designated there as God. The text represents him as being God. Jacob wrestles with God and he prevails, but he prevails from a place of absolute incapacitation. This man that is God that he beats in a wrestling match, this man simply touches his hip and his hip goes out of socket. So you see where all the power lies. The power's on the one side, and yet somehow this other one prevails. So he prevails with God effectively because God causes him to prevail. Well, that's this concept of Israel, and Jacob is that. The covenant is now bound up in him, and then Jacob is corporatized in his 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, obviously, Levi is out of that, and Joseph is reckoned twice, and we've discussed all of that.
Sure, right.
But the family of Jacob becomes Israel. They are the Abrahamic people. Okay, for what sake? They are the covenant household of Israel for the sake of fulfilling the Abrahamic election and vocation. Abraham was chosen by God to be his instrument, to be the one through whom all the families of the earth would be saved, the restoration of the human race, ultimately for the sake of the creation. Well, Israel is that entity. Israel is collectively son of God, collectively servant, disciple, the ones who are supposed to listen to God and be taught of God so that they could then manifest God in the world as a faithful son, and in that way witness to God to the world. So Israel collectively, this household that we call Israel, was the Abrahamic seed for the sake of the world. They were the Abrahamic offspring, the Abrahamic election. And what is happening in the Old Testament is God saying this son, this entity, this covenant entity that I have chosen for the sake of my purposes unto the world has failed and cannot fulfill its election and calling. And so I'm going to cause Israel to be Israel. And the way that I'm going to do it is by raising up from within Israel an Israelite, an entity from within Israel who will be what Israel could not be: faithful son, servant, disciple, and witness. And so in this one, I will restore and reconstitute Israel. I will gather and save Israel. So now at last the Abrahamic people, the Abrahamic household, can be the light of the nations, fulfill this work, unto the ends of the earth. And we're going to see this is the way the gospel accounts understand Jesus and how he's reconstituting the Abrahamic people around himself, beginning even with the 12 apostles and an initial Israelite church, right? But Paul understands this when he says in Galatians 3, when God made his promise to Abraham and his seed, meaning his offspring, what promise? In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. I will make you great. I will give you a great name. I will make you a great nation. Abraham, I'll make you the father of many. These promises, he says to Abraham and then to his offspring, he says, really, he wasn't talking about a seed as many offsprings, but a seed as one, who is the Messiah. Ultimately, God's intent was that Israel, as the Abrahamic people, was to find its own fulfillment, its own realization in truth in one particular descendant of Abraham, who is the Messiah. And that's why Paul says, if you belong to the Messiah, whether you are Jewish or Gentile or whatever, if you belong to him, the Messiah, that one true Abrahamic seed, then you are children of Abraham and you are heirs of the promises made to him. So the New Testament, certainly in the Gospels, but even in the epistles, in Paul's understanding and treatment, recognizes that, again, Israel was to become the Abrahamic people for the sake of the world, the Abrahamic covenant election for the world, in this one who was to come. That's the way the prophets had talked, and that's certainly the way the servant songs talk. So when we're talking about how can one man be the nation, it's not a numerical thing, it's a covenantal thing. It's a theological thing in that sense, that this is the way in which God is going to see to it that his promises to Abraham are fulfilled. Because unfortunately, the offspring of Abraham cannot fulfill its own election and calling. God will have to make Israel Israel indeed, so that it can fulfill its calling. And the way he's going to do this is by returning and empowering this servant Israel with his spirit. And now we're starting to kind of get a little bit close to this idea of incarnation, but still not, okay, substance of God, substance of man stuck together. This is God, as you said, this is God taking up Israel's own existence in order to heal and restore, and from within Israel, make Israel be Israel through the power of his spirit, so that his project for the world bound up in Abraham can actually go forward and be fulfilled.
Gotcha. So, kid, like I could see someone on the street saying, okay, got it. I take up Israel's lot in life. Jesus now represents this. This ties back to creation too. Is I still think there's going to be a lingering questions, which leads into our second follow-up question. Great. If Jesus fulfills the covenant for Israel, right? This is no longer a geographical conversation, right? This is not an ethnic conversation. What role does Israel still have in God's cosmic purposes too? And it sounds like, and I think I know where you're going to go, even that question and even that frame needs to be redefined, because many people, to the point you made earlier, are coming with the mathematical agenda or an ethnic agenda, right? Or a political agenda. And they've already essentially perverted the very intentions of how Scripture is speaking to these issues. Go ahead, Kit.
Well, just maybe to put a sharper final point on the previous discussion, you mentioned this thing of him being both sides of the covenant. Well, the covenant that God made with Israel defined, there were the two parties. There was God and Israel, right? And all that Sinai covenant was just God confirming and ratifying that Abrahamic relationship with Abraham's descendants. So it was really a furthering of the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant at Sinai was. But that was between God and the Abrahamic people, and that covenant defined God to Israel. This is who I am with respect to you. This is the nature of our relationship. And it defined Israel back to God and prescribed what Israel's sonship, its Abrahamic identity and vocation would look like. So Jesus then, if he is that Israelite in whom Israel becomes Israel indeed, but he is that as this is the way in which God comes and takes up Israel's life and lot to make Israel be Israel. then he is both sides of the covenant, because he is God unto Israel, according to that Abrahamic election and promise, but he's also Israel in truth, in faithfulness, as son, servant, disciple, and witness back to God. He brings together in himself both sides of that covenant. So he becomes then the true Israel. He is the essence of Israel. That means that now, and this, we'll get into this a lot more as we get into the New Testament, certainly into Paul's epistles and things the early church was wrestling with. But in the light of this fulfillment of Israel's own Abrahamic identity, election, calling in this one seed of Abraham, Jesus the Messiah, what does that mean for the redefining or the defining of Israel? How do we now think about Israel going forward? Because again, if Israel is the Abrahamic election for the sake of the world, when I keep saying Abrahamic election, Abraham was the elect one of God. God chose him for this role. Israel is the working of that out. It's the descendants of Abraham.
Sure.
They are God's election for that purpose. Well, if that Israelite identity and role and function now is fulfilled in the Messiah, that means that he now is the substance and the essence of Israel in truth, the Abrahamic seed. And it's upon himself, in connection with himself, that he's restoring the house of Israel. This is what Paul gets at as well. So in that sense, to state it very simply, and this will obviously be controversial in our culture, if Paul says that the way in which, let me put it this way. If Israel is defined as the covenant descendants of Abraham, the seed of Abraham, and Paul says that promise of a seed, a covenant seed, ultimately was looking to one individual who is Jesus the Messiah. And therefore, now who are the descendants, the covenant descendants or the covenant people of Abraham? Paul says it's everyone, Jew or Gentile, who belongs to the Messiah. So Israel is now defined around the Messiah, and Paul gets to the end of the epistle to the Galatians, and again, I know this will be controversial, but he talks about, and through Galatians, he's talked about how these things that have marked out Jews from Gentiles, circumcision, faithfulness to the Torah, how now in the Messiah, all of that has changed. Abrahamic identity, Abrahamic being a part of the Abrahamic household, that's all changed now in the Messiah. And so he says, circumcision doesn't matter anymore. Uncircumcision doesn't matter anymore. What matters is a new creation, the new creation in the Messiah. And as many as will walk according to that new principle, that new rule, that new foundational truth, mercy and peace be upon them, even upon the Israel of God. Now, a lot of Bible versions say, and upon the Israel of God. So all of those who are part of this new creation in Jesus, yes, but also upon Israel, as if it's a separate thing. Well, that completely undermines Paul's whole argument in that book. And that expression, Israel of God, he only uses it one time in all of his writings. Paul, the apostle, it's there. And he's identifying that what the prophets had said God was going to do. God was going to reconstitute his covenant household, the Abrahamic people, in and around this son of David, this servant, who would gather in the people of Israel, would also gather in the nations. This is Isaiah's prophecy. This is Hosea. This is Zechariah, others of the prophets. And this is what Paul recognized. The covenant household of God, Israel, is now defined by the Messiah himself. So what does that mean for Israel today, for a land or the Jewish people? Paul would say that not all Israel is Israel. And he's not a Jew. He's not a Judean. He's not a true descendant of Abraham who is one outwardly with circumcision done in the flesh. And I know this is controversial, but this is everywhere in the New Testament. So I'm sure that some people are saying, oh, you're talking about replacement theology. You're talking about the church
Yeah.
replacing Israel. That's what we hear all the time. Oh, this
Right.
is replacement. God's done with the Jews. He doesn't care about the Jews. He's all about the Gentiles now. No, we're not saying that. We're saying that in Jesus himself, as the son of Abraham, the son of David, the true Adam, a new Adam, the last Adam, he is forming the new human family, the new creational human family
Yeah.
around himself that God intended all along and that he
Right.
began to introduce in the book in Genesis 1 and 2. So this is God's covenant household. These are the people of Abraham who belong to the Messiah. And Paul says that in Ephesians, you Gentiles are now fellow members in God's household. Not because you've become circumcised, not because you're Jewish proselytes, not because you're following Israel's Torah, but because you're joined to the Messiah. And so Jews, also ethnic descendants of Abraham, only become Israelites indeed, Jews indeed, Paul would say, when they are joined to the Messiah.
Right.
It's in the Messiah that God is forming his new Israel. And that's not replacing Israel or getting rid of the Jews or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But this is at the center, I think, of so much confusion in our culture. And, it not only affects our theology and the way we think about evangelism or who, the Jewish people or who Israel is, but it obviously even affects our geopolitics and a lot of our foreign policy, which is not a good thing.
Yeah, like I think that leads into our last question too, as we wrap up this first part too. But it's so great. Like, where does this leave individual believers? Because we know that's at the end of the day why people come to these Sunday services, right? Is hey, that's great. Give me the sermon, but where is my individual application? And so, speak to that part, Kit, too, because like I think you've already alluded to, and like I know where you're going with this. But for the person on the street, just where does it leave the individual believer in terms of their fit and integration if Jesus has already fulfilled everything too?
Well, I guess I'm not entirely clear what you're asking. Are you asking in terms of what does this mean for our salvation, or what does this mean for our obedience,
Yeah,
or
yeah, all of that too. Yeah, because like I think, and maybe to frame it a different way, Kid, too, is I think someone could walk away saying, "Great, Jesus has now redefined this. Everything is now reconstituted. Reconstituted. He has now redefined what Israel is. But if he has done all this and he has fulfilled all of this, I think like there's a definitely a works implication here, Kid, in terms of it's like, great, what is left for me to do as an individual believer if Jesus has done all this on my behalf too? Is where does that now lead me to if I'm to rightly understand this in a fully formed fashion?
well, if Jesus is reconstituting Israel around himself, and by Israel again, we're talking about God's covenant household. If Jesus is reconstituting God's covenant people around himself, Paul says that people that he calls the church is the fullness of him who fills all in all. And so that Abrahamic vocation, that Abrahamic calling that has its yes and amen in Jesus, is that in and through this Abrahamic household, this Abrahamic people, God is going to bring his blessing to all the families of the earth and gather in the nations to him. Okay, well, Jesus is that Abrahamic seed. He's the one who's doing that. He's that son of Abraham. Well, how is he doing that? He's doing that through the people in whom he has his fullness. If we are Christians in the way the Bible understands it, it's not just that we've agreed to some information about someone who died on a cross. It's not just that we've admitted that we're sinners and that we're on our way to hell. It's not just that we've prayed to ask Jesus into our hearts. It's not that we've agreed to certain doctrine, or certain confessions or whatever. What makes us Christians is if we have been raised up, made alive so as to share in the life of the resurrected Messiah. We are Christians if, as Paul puts it, you died and your lives are hidden with Christ in God. We are a part of God's new creation, this new creation that has its substance in Jesus. We have been raised up in him. We now inhabit that new creational realm in the Messiah. We have been taken up in the life of God by the Spirit through union with Christ. That's what it is to be a Christian. Well, that means that Jesus is doing what he does. He's fulfilling his own status and identity as God's true Israel through the people who share in his life and likeness. And this is really at the heart of even what we call the Great Commission at the end of Matthew's gospel. Jesus is resurrected. He's about to take his throne at the right hand of God. And he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And so go and make disciples of all nations. So this work of the Abrahamic people was to be the light of the nations, to carry the knowledge of God, the truth of God, to all of the families of the earth, that God would gather to himself a people drawn from every tribe and tongue and nation and people. That's our missions mandate. That's our evangelism mandate. That's how Jesus is fulfilling his own identity as the son of Abraham, as the true Israel. He's doing that through the people in which he has his fullness, who are enlivened, empowered, led by his Spirit. That's how he's doing his work. So what does this mean for us in terms of our salvation? It means that we are saved if we are a part of the Abrahamic household. Well, how do we know if we're a part of the Abrahamic household? Because we're Jewish? Because we're circumcised? No. Do we belong to the Messiah? Then we're a part of God's covenant household. Well, what does it mean to belong to the Messiah? It means to be taken up in his own life, to be made new, to be born again, if we want to use that language, but more precisely, it's to be sharers in the Messiah's resurrection life through the Spirit, to be born of the Spirit, to be a part of God's new creation. And that is the work of the Spirit that happens to us through faith, right? So if we are saved, then we are sharers in the Messiah's life. We are Christ people in the world. I no longer live, Christ lives in me, Paul says. That's what it is to be a Christian. Okay, so now what do we do? If we're Christians, what do we do? Well, we're about this business of being Christ in the world, being about the work that he is doing, being about the work that he's doing through his Spirit. And that looks like evangelism. It looks like the communion of the saints. It looks like striving with the gifts and the leading of the Spirit to see every man presented complete in Christ. It looks like the healthy life of the church. It looks like all of those things. It looks like our own individual pursuit of conformity to Christ, walking in the Spirit. Because what God is working towards is not getting individual souls into a place called heaven. He's working towards having a vast human family of which Christ is the head as a new Adam, a people of every tribe and tongue and nation and people, Revelation 5, that we would reign on the earth, that we will fulfill that human vocation of kings and priests that was first given in Genesis 1 and 2. That's what this is all about. So it does involve us individually, but it involves us as we are a part of this spiritual organism, lives hidden with Christ in God through the Spirit. And as this new body of Christ, we are the instruments of the Spirit's work of working out this new creation in the world unto that day when all things are summed up in the Messiah and God becomes all in all. So it's an individual thing, but it's a corporate thing. But ultimately, it's about why are we even doing what we're doing? What is this about? Oh, we need to be winning souls. No, I would argue we don't need to be winning souls. We need to be doing this work of building the kingdom. And I'm not saying we shouldn't care about people getting saved, but we've made this whole Christian project just be about getting people somehow to get saved so their soul can go to heaven. And we say, we did it, we're done. Well, that's not what God's project is all about. And we have to be about what God is about.